I'm at 90% of last year still, and they're hoping to take me higher.
Yeah. So your percentage spend down.
Gosh. The percentage that's obligated, or the percentage that I have allocated to somebody if the paperwork isn't done yet?
Whichever one they track and yell at us.
The one that they track and yell at us.
So it's a few minutes afternoon, and I can officially say good afternoon. I'm Amy Friedlander. I work in the SBE front office, and in the last few months, I've been working with Carl Landwehr and Kevin Thompson on the trustworthy computing projects. Today, we obviously have a speaker who is joining us to talk about the notion of trust, and therefore unpacking the notion of trust and trustworthy computing. Our speaker, Paul Harris, is a leading scholar who has examined fundamentals of the ways we learn to trust and to distrust. He has a distinguished career beginning in the UK and continuing in the US at Harvard, where he joined the faculty in 2001. He is now the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Education. Enumerating his achievements would take the better part of the hour and wouldn't be nearly as much fun as listening to Dr. Harris. So take it away, and for those of you who have taken the time to join us at lunchtime, repeat your
Okay, thank you, Amy. So, just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a developmental psychologist, as I think Amy explained, and for the last few years, I have been working on the topic of trust. And my focus is on the extent to which children are prepared to learn from other people and to receive information from them and to accept the information that's provided in a credulous fashion. Now, you can imagine, of course, that sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. But I guess in the course of the talk, I'll try to explain that this particular emphasis is relatively new and unusual in developmental psychology. So let me just move through my slides, and then I'll get to that particular important point. Just mentioning various important collaborators. And I guess it's useful to clarify one of the things I'm not going to do as compared to one of the things that I am going to do. So in terms of mistrust, that mistrust might arise when a user supplies information and that information, which is important to them or precious to them, is passed on in ways that they dislike. Let me emphasize that that particular issue is not terribly relevant to preschool children or young children. They're pretty much inclined to share information with other people. They're not very nervous about the risks of its being passed on. So in that sense, breaches of trust of that type are not what I'll be talking about today. But there's another, as it were, converse pattern of mistrust, which is what occurs when the user receives information. So this is not information that the user is sending, but information that the user is receiving, which for various reasons might be untrustworthy. And of course, in the case of children, that's perhaps an even bigger risk than it might be for adults, although I'll try to argue that actually there are major continuities between the way that children select information and the way that adults select information. So in terms of the two flows or directions of information flow, this is the direction which I'm going to be focusing on today. The extent to which children are selective in an appropriate fashion about the information that they receive, rather than the extent to which they're concerned about losing information which is personal to them because they've handed it on to somebody who misuses it. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to say a little bit about the theoretical background, and one way to highlight the contrast between what I want to say and what has been fairly traditional in developmental psychology is to set up this contrast between the child as a scientist versus the child as a trusting disciple. It's a simplification, but it captures a lot of the dichotomies that I want to talk about. Then I'll move on and give you some brief illustrations of the way in which children are credulous. And then, importantly, I'll discuss ways in which even children try to avoid being misled. How do they avoid the dangers of their own credulity, so to speak? Okay, so let's say a word about the theoretical background. So, if you look back at some of the hoary classics in education and developmental psychology, names like Rousseau, Piaget, and Montessori are prominent. And if you read their works, you get a very compelling image of a child as somebody who's an autonomous learner. There's a passage in Émile Rousseau's book about education where he says, if the child asks you a question, beware of answering it. Let the child go figure it out for himself. And if you move on to Rousseau's compatriot Piaget, you see a whole theoretical apparatus implying that children are best off when they learn autonomously, because if you hand them information, they will, in some sense, assimilate it, but they'll not have a deep understanding of what you've told them. They'll be inclined to what Piaget called verbalism or parroting. And one of his classic examples is counting. He argues that children can be taught to learn to count, where they offer the sequence of numbers, but they don't in any sense have a deep understanding of the principles of number. For example, they don't realize that a set of numbers or a set of items, when rearranged, preserves its number. It doesn't change its number just by virtue of rearrangement. If you take somebody like Montessori, she argues that children learn best when they are given concrete materials, and when they interact with those materials and educate themselves, so to speak. And the hallmark of good teaching is when the teacher has retreated and the child is absorbed, curious, and engaged in exploration. Now, it's fair to say that that line of research continues today, and if you look at some of the leading titles in developmental psychology, you will see titles like the Scientist in the Crib or The Philosophical Baby, and so forth, all written by respected and liked colleagues of myself. But nevertheless, I don't fully agree with them, because what they're arguing is that there are deep parallels between children and scientists. Children should, like a scientist, do their own experiments, explore, gather data, and revise their theories accordingly. And there are various problems, I think, with that analogy. Let me just highlight one. If you look at science as an institution, historians disagree about its precise historical origins. But I think most of them agree that it's, as it were, a few centuries old. On the other hand, if you think about children's cognitive development, it's been something that's been going on for millennia. So it would be somewhat odd if children's development happened to have the characteristics of a human institution which was several centuries old. It's much more likely to have the characteristics of institutional arrangements and practices which are much more ancient, whether they be religion or apprenticeships or education. And those three, of course, that I've just mentioned, religion, apprenticeships, and education, don't treat the child as an autonomous learner. They treat the child as a very dependent learner. More importantly, if we think about the fact that human beings, perhaps unique among the primates, depend for their survival and their well-being on learning the cultural tools which have been developed by their particular group, then you could imagine that evolution has selected for children to be receptive rather than autonomous learners. Receptive learners who, as it were, are attentive to what their forebears will tell them and in some sense, children then might be best off if they're deferential rather than, so to speak, stubborn autodidacts. So this vision that Rousseau promulgated of the child learning best when the child is left to figure things out for him or herself, in some sense is a misrepresentation, so to speak, even of the state of nature for the human species. The state of nature for the human species are children who are well disposed and attentive to those who are better informed than them, but unlike any other species, also able to imbibe, assimilate, and reinterpret information that they get from other members of the species in a very efficient and effective fashion. So I'll say a little bit more about that receptivity in a moment. Okay, so you can see that in some sense I want to argue that children are trusting disciples rather than autonomous scientists. And as you'll see in a moment, then that will lead to questions about how they avoid being misled, as well as how they gain trustworthy information. So this is a list of some recent studies which back up my point. Let me just pick out one or two and give you a flavor of them, because they illustrate, I think, the extent to which children are credulous. So let me describe perhaps the very first one, some very intriguing work by Derek Lyons. But I need to step back a moment in describing it. So two primatologists, Guigan and Whiten, were looking at imitation in chimpanzees. And they were interested in the extent to which a young chimpanzee might learn how to process a fruit by stripping off what's inedible and getting the interior, which is edible. So their question really was driven by the notion that young chimpanzees learn from older chimpanzees. And so they set up an experiment in which the chimpanzee was not given a fruit, but they were given a box to open. And the experimenters offered two different demonstrations. One was relatively straightforward and efficient. They stabbed the box with a stick and poked something inside the box and dragged it out with the help of the stick. And watching this, the chimpanzees were able to efficiently copy what they had seen. They also offered us more elaborate demonstration in which they twirled the stick above the box, or they poked it into an empty chamber before they poked it into the place where the reward was located. If you gave the chimpanzees that demonstration, they were inclined to ignore it. In other words, when they saw the demonstrator doing something that they couldn't see the point of, they put it aside and stuck to their own relatively efficient procedure. So that makes sense. On the other hand, the surprise came when McGuigan and Whiten tested young children who were around 4 or 5 years of age. Again, with the efficient demonstration, the children copied that demonstration. But when they showed the children that more elaborate and somewhat inefficient demonstration that included impractical elements, what was surprising was that the children were relatively conscientious imitators. They copied this more elaborate demonstration. Lyons has pursued this line of work by showing that even when you give the child incentives to revert to the more efficient procedure, for example, the child is likely to lose a reward unless the child gets this box open as soon as possible, or rather gets the reward inside the box as soon as possible. If children have been shown this inefficient and elaborate procedure, they feel compelled to stick to it. So in some sense, you could argue that the child is less intelligent, less sophisticated than the chimpanzee. But a different way to look at this is to say, well, if you think about it, a child growing up in a human culture will be confronted by all sorts of procedures which, from the child's perspective, are not transparent. Think about cooking, think about tool preparation, think about fishing. In other words, I'm inviting you to think about contexts where there's no particularly advanced technology. But even in those cultures, there will be procedures which the child won't fully understand. But it behoves the child actually to follow those procedures because presumably over generations they have proved to be effective or less risky than more direct procedures. So the speculation, which I think has now been reinforced in various ways, both by work with other primates and further experimentation with children, is that children, in some sense, are inclined to engage in what we might call overimitation. This is the name that's been given in the literature, but that has deep biological roots. Whilst at first sight it looks inefficient, it means that the child can capitalize on the wisdom of previous generations, which the child might not fully understand. Just briefly to mention another line of research, work by Vikram Jaswal, who I think was among you recently here at NSF for a short time. So Vikram has done work where the child is shown an object that is a kind of hybrid. So he takes the computer illustrations of, say, a horse and a cow and blends the two together, so the child is confronted with a horse cow. But the computer can tilt it, of course, in either direction, so it may look mostly like a cow and a little bit like a horse. So you show the child this picture and you ask the child what it is, and the child says, well, it's a cow. Indeed, most of the perceptual features lend support to that characterization. But if you say to the child who's 4 or 5 years of age, you're not going to believe this, but that's really a horse, the child will then shift gears, and if you ask the child, well, what does this creature do? Does it neigh, or does it moo? Does it eat grass, or does it eat hay, and so on and so forth? The child will go along with this adult testimony. So even though the bulk of the perceptual evidence led the child to give a plausible answer, the child will set that aside and defer to the adult's more alternative categorization. So in both of these cases, deferential overimitation, deferential categorization, we're seeing the child say to itself effectively, well, I can make a perfectly good judgment here, and left to the child's own devices, he or she will enact that. The child will open the box efficiently or judge this to be a cow. But if you intervene and offer the child something that's opaque, the child, unlike the chimpanzee, is inclined to be credulous or deferential, depending upon which adjective you want to label the child with. Well, there are other illustrations that I could talk about, but I think that gives you the flavor of this line of recent research, which is moving away from thinking of the child as stubbornly self-sufficient and emphasizing the child's capacity to set their self-sufficiency to one side and listen to an alternative. So this newer research actually fits in, interestingly, with some very ancient ideas, of course, about credulity. So here's a Scottish philosopher, Thomas Reid, and as you can see, Reid thinks of the capacity for trust as innate, effectively, and argues that it's more or less unlimited in children. That position is echoed by a 20th century philosopher, Russell, and his junior, so to speak, Wittgenstein. And it's even echoed by latter-day non-philosophers. Here's one, Richard Dawkins, who puts a biological or evolutionary twist, which you might think of as fitting in with what I just said. So he's arguing that there will be an advantage to children in believing without question whatever grown-ups tell them. And he's arguing that on the grounds that children run risks and the best protection for them is to be attentive to the warnings they get from adults, and they'll be more likely to live a longer and happy life if they are trusting. Now, up to a point, I agree with all of these commentators, but it does seem to me that we shouldn't go too far. So in other words, I think Dawkins is going too far when he says, believe without question whatever your grown-ups tell you. And here's the cautionary side of what I want to say then, with respect to this general claim that children are credulous or definite. The argument is that children are surprisingly credulous or indiscriminate in choosing what to believe. On the other hand, they're very selective in choosing whom to believe. So, in some sense, even if they're not terribly scrupulous about the message, they do tend to monitor the messenger. If you notice, in the case of Dawkins, he doesn't mention that kind of discrimination or selectivity. He's simply implying that children should believe whatever grown-ups tell them, effectively irrespective of who those grown-ups are. So now let me show you some research that I've been doing with various students, which is emphasizing this capacity for selective trust or selective credulity. I'm going to try to illustrate very briefly two broad strategies that children use. One is to keep track of individuals who are familiar to them, and more specifically to keep track of their epistemic history, the extent to which in the past they've been reliable. Now that works, of course, fine if the person is familiar to the child. So how does a child cope meeting somebody relatively new? Well, under those circumstances, children seem to be especially alert to clues that this person is a member of your particular cultural community or your cultural group. And more specifically, this person is somebody who gets endorsed by other members of your community. A consensus clusters around this particular informant. And what I'll try to show you then is that children, even quite young children, preschool children, 3, 4, and 5 years of age, show these kinds of selectivities. So just to start with the first claim, that children are attentive to past history with a person. We know from a lot of work in developmental psychology, especially on the child's emotional development, that children are quite selective in the first year of life in who they seek reassurance and comfort from. Most children show this selectivity, and it's only after relatively extreme deprivation that you end up with a child who doesn't show that kind of selectivity. So, for example, following the Ceausescu regime, many children were found in orphanages, and those children have been tracked both in the United States and in the UK. And those children, as adolescents, are surprisingly indiscriminate in the extent to which they'll approach somebody they've met for the first time and engage with them in ways that a typically developing child would not. So here we have one possible basis for the child's selectivity to receive information from those who have looked after the child and to whom the child has formed an attachment. So we gave children some normal objects to look at, and we introduced them to two women who were actually both working as caregivers in a preschool. The woman on the left was familiar to the children in one preschool. The other woman was unfamiliar to them. But we worked in two preschools such that the children in the second preschool found the woman in red familiar and the woman with blonde hair unfamiliar. Okay, so these two women look at this object, and one suggests that it's a wug and the other suggests that it's a dax. And in center one you can see that at all three age groups, 3, 4, and 5 years of age, if you turn to the child and say, well, she called it a wug, she called it a dax, what do you think? Children go along with the person who's familiar to the caregiver one. But if we now rerun this experiment in the other daycare, the results flip over. So even early on, we're seeing this relatively strong preference for learning new information from somebody who's taken care of you. We've also been looking at, though, the extent to which children are sensitive to whether the information they're getting from these familiar caregivers is accurate or inaccurate. So here's one simple illustration of that experiment. The child meets two strangers. So these are two caregivers that they've not encountered before, two women they've not encountered before. And we give them some familiarization trials and some test trials. That's half the children. And we come back 4 days later and some more test trials. The other half, we come back 1 week later, and those children too get some test trials. So let me say now a word about both the familiarization trials and the test trials. In the familiarization trial, the child is shown a highly familiar object, a ball, and one of them, plausibly enough, calls it that's a ball, but she's lost her costume, but let's not worry about that. She calls it by its wrong name, she calls it a shoe, and since of course the children know what this object is called, they're somewhat puzzled by this. So the child gets 3 or 4 trials like this, these familiarization trials where, let's call her Miss Red, proves to be accurate, and Miss Yellow on the other side, or Miss Blue, proves to be inaccurate. After that, we show the child this unfamiliar object, and the two women now offer names that the child can't evaluate. So one calls it a wug and one calls it a dax. But one of those women, of course, is recognizable as somebody who's been accurate hitherto. So even if you can't assess the likelihood of its being a wug or a dax, you might say to yourself, well, let me go with the person who's proven reliable. And that's what children do. Here's the proportion of times that children go with the reliable informant, the person who was accurate in naming the ball and so forth, both when we give them these test trials on the same day, and even when we come back 4 days later, children remember who was accurate or reliable and who was unreliable. You remember the other children we tested after a week, and you can see that children have a relatively stable memory even after 1 week. After those 2 or 3 minutes of unreliable information giving, children retain that profile, so to speak, of the two women, and they continue to prefer to learn even after a week. They've not seen these women in the interval, but they recognize who was the more reliable, and they choose to learn from the more reliable. Okay, I won't dwell on that. I just want to emphasize briefly that this particular experiment I've just shown you fits in with a bunch of others. These are very robust findings. Now, I've given you two pieces of information, so to speak. Children prefer to learn from familiar informants. Children prefer to learn from accurate informants. Now we can pit those two against one another. What happens if the child is confronted by somebody that they recognize, to whom they have an attachment, who's a familiar caregiver, but suddenly proves to be unreliable? Do they opt for familiarity, or do they prefer somebody who is reliable? So to run this experiment, we went back to those two daycares that I mentioned a moment ago, where we found that children preferred the daycare giver, the daycare provider that they knew, and we tested children with these kinds of test trials in which the object is unfamiliar. If you recall, the two women give competing names. I've already shown you this setup. And those are the data that we found, but now I've rearranged the data because, unbeknownst to the children who are occupying these white bars will, in a moment, discover that their familiar caregiver will continue to prove reliable. But these children who prefer their familiar caregiver, just like these children, they don't know it yet, but at this stage, in the middle, so to speak, of the experiment, they're going to see their familiar caregiver start making mistakes. At this point, of course, the children don't know, as it were, which group they're in, and they're equally keen on their familiar caregiver, preferring her to the unfamiliar caregiver. Okay, so in this interim stage, we do what I've shown you before, which is that we show a familiar object which is named correctly by one person and named incorrectly by the other. But as I've just explained, half the children saw the familiar caregiver be correct, half the children saw the unfamiliar caregiver be correct. So let's move on to the results. And the results are those three bars on the right. So essentially what happens is that the 3-year-olds are saying, you could reword their reaction by saying they ignore information about the caregiver accuracy that was presented at this interim phase. It's as if they're saying, well, I'm just going to go with the woman I know. I don't care if she's proven unreliable, I'll stick with the person I know. So they continue, irrespective of whether she's proven unreliable or reliable, to prefer the familiar person. But look at the 5-year-olds. If she's proven reliable, they continue to prefer her, but if she's proven unreliable, they abandon trust in her, and they start learning from the unfamiliar caregiver. Now we're still working on this developmental change, but it seems we find it in other domains as well, but it looks as if in the early years, children are, so to speak, programmed to primarily attend to cues of attachment and familiarity. They learn best, they trust most immediate family members who have looked after them in the past. As children move on to 4 or 5 years of age, it looks as if their horizon expands and they're more judgmental about their nearest and dearest, and they will keep a record of potential informants, and as it were, shift in their learning if somebody who's familiar to them proves less accurate, less trustworthy, less reliable than somebody who's much less familiar to them. I'm tempted to say again, in line with the evolutionary speculations I was starting with, that this is, as it were, a pre-programmed strategy in human development. The child is initially looked after by a relatively small group of people, but the child should be ready to learn from other members of the community, not just members of the extended family or those who offer caregiving. And these data would suggest that children are ready to move, so to speak, from that, what we might think of as vertical learning, where they learn from those immediately above them or adjacent to them, to a more diagonal or horizontal form of learning, where they reach out to the larger community. Okay. So that's essentially what I've just said. Familiarity and attachment get you started, but they don't carry you very far. Okay, now, at this point, you can step back and ask, this is in some sense, a more narrowly psychological question, and I don't have a full answer to it, but I want to emphasize at least two options. So the child, certainly by the age of 5, is attentive to somebody's past history. But they could think of reliability in two different ways. One possibility is that they think of a reliable person who's somebody who actually tells the truth. If you look carefully, you can see that this is not actually Moses, it's Charlton Heston. Bearing witness to the truth. But another possibility is that children look at this reliable person and think of them as somebody who fits the norms. Because if you think about it, the woman who misnamed objects was in some sense saying something false, but was also not fitting in with the practices of the community. So we don't have a full answer to this dilemma. Is the child sensitive to those who play fast and loose with the truth, or is the child sensitive to those who violate the norms of your group? But we do have evidence to show that these normative violations are something that the child will attend to even when there's no truth violation. So let me give you a brief example of that. So this was an experiment in which we had two different conditions, which in the end didn't make a big difference. The children behaved the same way in each. We had two speakers, and each of them, in the meaningful condition, read an extract from this familiar story, Curious George. So they would say 3 or 4 lines from Curious George. In the meaningless condition, we had the poem by Lewis Carroll, the Jabberwocky poem, which doesn't make any sense. Now the important thing was that the two speakers fit the child's cultural expectations to varying degrees. In actual fact, the child didn't know this, but in actual fact, these two women were bilingual speakers of English and Spanish. And they were unaccented in both English and Spanish. If you listen to them as a native speaker of English, you would have thought they were native speakers of English. If you listened to them speaking Spanish and you were a native speaker, you would have thought they were native speakers. However, they were good at pretending that they were non-native speakers. So essentially what we did was to get them to, for some of the children, the woman on the left spoke native English, and this woman spoke with, as it were, Spanish accent, and for the other half of the children, we flipped it over so that she spoke as if she were a native speaker of English, and she spoke with a Spanish accent. Okay. In the next stage of the experiment, the children saw these two women offer a demonstration of how to act on this unfamiliar object from the hardware store. They did different actions, and at this point, once they'd seen both women show them, how to use this, the child was given this object and asked to show the experimenter how you use this. So the child had the choice of either imitating this woman or imitating that woman. What we found was that the child imitated the woman with a native accent in English. So just to spell out the implications, here the child is listening to somebody and extrapolating from their conformity to the cultural norms of how you speak in English to non-verbal tasks where the child is learning how to use a new tool. It can't be to do with the fact that the child understands the native speaker better because we used that Jabberwocky passage, which is meaningless in any case. So it looks as if children, even as it were in preschool years, are acutely sensitive to those who belong and prefer to learn cultural practices from those who belong as compared to those who, in some sense, belong but are deviating from the norms in these subtle ways that non-native speakers do. Here's another demonstration of children's social antennae at work. Perhaps best just to show you the setup. We had an unfamiliar object again. This is a kind of master of ceremonies. Two women who call this object a different name. She might call it a dax, she might call it a wug. But at this point, when she calls it a dax, these two women look on with approbation, smiling, no particular dissent. But when this woman calls it a wug, particularly Cassie, as you can see, a very good actress, is really showing skepticism. Okay, when those bystanders are present, children overwhelmingly prefer the name provided by the woman who gathers bystander assent as opposed to dissent. In the next stage of the experiment, we ask these two women, the bystanders, to leave. And we just continue, so another object is placed on the table. These two women offer conflicting names. There's no bystanders offering the child cues, but nevertheless, even though the bystanders have left, children prefer the woman who got bystander assent. So children seem, as it were, sensitive not just online, but offline to an informant who seemed to gather a consensus around what she was saying. Here's another illustration of the same point. We had 4 women here, and the experimenter said, can you point to the wug? And you can see that Miss Blue is a misfit in the sense that, unlike the other 3 women who are pointing here, she's pointing over there. The reason, let me just underline this, the reason why we shifted to this procedure is because we said to ourselves, well, maybe the woman who gathers bystander assent is perceived as more likable because the 2 bystanders are either smiling at her or frowning at the other person. So we wanted to check the extent to which children are sensitive just to consent in a more cognitive or neutral fashion. Is somebody who gathers, whose opinion is endorsed by other people, somebody who the child is prepared to learn from. So when the consensus was present, children preferred to go along with that consensus. But then in the second stage of the experiment, we would retain the misfit and one of the members of the consensus, and they would offer conflicting information. We would turn to the child, and you can see that same results as before. Children seem to want to go with the flow in the sense that they prefer somebody who's gained endorsement from others. Okay, so let me just sum up where I am. So strong evidence for this, what I call vertical learning from familiar informants who surround the child, developmental shift from familiarity to accuracy, and then, as we've seen, when the child is looking further afield, the child is especially inclined to seek out those people who are culturally typical and to learn from people who gain endorsement from others. So let me now try and think about how this might apply to the internet, and to some extent I'm thinking about this from the point of view of the young child, but I think these questions, the dilemmas that face the young child are also present for the adult. So what I've emphasized is that young children are especially sensitive to who conveys information to them in all sorts of ways, with respect to familiarity, past history, accent, endorsement, and so on and so forth. But in the case of the internet, the author of any given message is much more difficult to appraise. You may not even know who the author is. You've got no preceding, well, not always, rarely have you a preceding history of interaction. It's not as if you could say, this is an author who I've seen on the internet before and who I trust. So not only do you lack familiarity, even if you do recognize, you rarely have an index of accuracy or inaccuracy. You don't know which culture or which cultural group or which community. Of course, you'll have some clues, but those are often opaque to the, as it were, the source of the particular group from which the message comes. And you'll rarely have any indices of the extent to which this message, this particular message, is something that's unique to that site or endorsed by other people. Now, it does seem to me then, well, here's one way of thinking about it, that messages on the internet have a quasi-Delphic quality. They emanate, as it were, from the computer, but children don't know their provenance. Now, adults are more sophisticated, adults can presumably dig behind a message, but in lots of cases, it's going to be tricky for them too. So at least if we're thinking about children and how to make them navigate more effectively, I think we have to provide them with some of the tools which come naturally to them. But exactly how technically feasible that is, I'm not sure, but let me mention a couple that do seem technically feasible. So I'm thinking about eBay, where I'm not sure how many years ago, but eBay instituted, in some sense, a reliability index. Users can rate the trustworthiness of a message that somebody has posted. And insofar as I know, that's been a successful innovation in the sense that people use eBay with more confidence than they would otherwise. Another example which comes to mind is Wikipedia, which often flags entries that have yet to be fully edited. But of course the default with respect to Wikipedia is that it's, in some sense, survived the bystander test. That's to say, this message has received endorsement from those in the know, otherwise it would have been edited. And if it's not in that state, well, you are flagged by Wikipedia in the sense that you're told this is a relatively recent unedited entry, so, as it were, user beware. I don't know, of course, how much this could be applied to other information sites, but they do have the appeal of being cues which, as I say, are very intuitive in the sense that they're used by 4- and 5-year-old children So I think I should stop there. Get comments and questions from you. Yes.
Fascinating presentation, and the area that we're looking at has to do with characters on screen that children know, like Elmo. And we're finding that meaningful characters like Elmo, children learn better, like seriation skills, when they're nesting pups. These are 21-month-olds. Better than if it's an unfamiliar character from another culture, in this instance, Dodo. And, you know, and the familiar character, same voice, same everything, it's just a different puppet. So when you're talking about the internet, and they both beat, actually Dodo does not beat baseline, but Elmo beats baseline. So Elmo is clearly superior, even though the message is same. Now, this is a video, and it would seem to me that on the internet, that one way that you could deal with trustworthiness is to take characters that children know and trust, like Elmo, or, you know, that they have a lot of, you know, because it's not just caregivers in the home, media are ever present. So that if they see Elmo on screen, they would trust Elmo on the screen in terms of the video, but also online. So going somewhere like Sesame Street or PBS or something like that might be potentially a window. I guess that would be my question to you about, you know, how do you know, because you mentioned Curious George, is that a video, is that a book, or, you know, those characters are central to pushing kids out all different kinds of content on different platforms.
Right. Well, just to clarify, in our case, the job didn't, so far as we know, identify any particular character in this short text. They were being cued simply by the accent of the speaker. But I would connect up what you're finding with familiar characters to all the data that I showed you with respect to the familiar caregivers in the preschool. And so I'm very intrigued to hear these results. I hadn't thought about the as it were, the kind of mediating role that characters can play on the internet, but seems to me you're absolutely right. In some sense, they can play that mediating role for hundreds of thousands of children, where in some sense they are widely familiar. Yeah, so that strikes me as a very interesting and provocative idea. I guess you have to make sure that Elmo continues to give reliable information, because my data would suggest that children will pick up if he doesn't and start mistrusting him. So make sure that Elmo delivers the right goods, but if Elmo does deliver the right goods, it's going to be trusted. And I mean, so you're also finding that even in the case of information which is in some sense cognitively taxing, like seriation, these characters are effective.
Elmo is effective. Dodo, who is from Taiwan, who's popular in Taiwan, is not effective.
And the Taiwanese children will learn better from Dodo than Elmo, in principle.
Presumably, but you know, the problem is that kids in Taiwan know Elmo. Elmo is kind of a universal character, so yes, but I would love to run that.
I see.
If it were possible.
But Elmo, I mean, to go with Sesame Street, can't be the right character, because Elmo is a peer. They see Elmo do stupid things on TV. None of this is looking at how people choose. The stuff with the kids is not looking at how they gather information from peers. By using adults, you've sort of implicitly already made them caretakers, authority figures. And how you choose what peers to learn from or identify with would be a separate research domain.
It is in a sense, but you know, it's called a parasocial relationship, where kids create relationships with media characters.
Sure.
And Elmo is a prototypical 2-year-old.
Right.
So what we're looking at is really, in essence, a horizontal kind of relationship rather than a vertical one.
As opposed to what this is.
He's talking about vertical, but I'm also talking about that those characters could be used in some very functional ways to address this internet and credibility questions.
There is some research comparing children's willingness to learn from a peer versus an adult. And I mean, the basic findings are that children, even around 3-4 years of age, are beginning to figure out that children and adults have differential areas of expertise. So question about a toy, they'll turn to a child. A question about what's healthy eating, they'll turn to an adult. But nevertheless, even there, reliability turns out to be important. So in fact, Vikram Jaswal found that if an adult proves less reliable than the child's typical preference for the adult over the child will be turned over, and the child will start shifting toward the child. So again, data suggesting that reliability or expertise is the increasingly important criterion that children are using. Yeah.
So there's a significant number of children that fall into the black boxes, percentage. Did you try to find out what's going on there? Because you said you repeated the experiment with the same group of children, with a similar experiment. Is it the same group of children that go into the black box? Is it noise or are there personality traits that account for that?
I think some of it's noise, but we do have some data on individual differences. And one of the interesting, some way disturbing findings that we found was with a group of about 120 children who, in collaboration with a colleague in the UK, were followed longitudinally. So these children were assessed for their relationship to their mother at around 14 months. And to cut a long story short, some children had a good, secure relationship with their mother, and others had what is typically called an insecure attachment. And within those insecure children, there were some who were characterized as avoiding the mother, and there were some who seemed to be kind of ambivalent. And we came back, as it were, when the children were 4 years of age and 5 years of age, and at both of those age points we got similar findings, namely that if the children received information from their mother as compared to a stranger, the children who were securely attached preferred their mother, both at 4 years of age and 5 years of age. The children who were ambivalent, if anything, preferred their mother, but too much. So even if she gave them information that was somewhat dubious relative to the object that we were presenting them with, they were inclined to prefer their mother over the stranger, who in some sense was giving them more trustworthy information. But the most striking group were the children who, as I say, at 14 months had been diagnosed as avoidant. And they showed no preference for the mother at 4 years of age or 5 years of age. So a stranger was as good for them as their mother. So we were taken aback by, I mean, that was a kind of null result, but it proved we found it both at 4 years of age and at 5 years of age. So when I say a familiar person, I should really add an important rider to that, a familiar person with whom you have a particular kind of attachment. But that's, I must admit, so far, the only way in which we've looked at individual differences. There are other investigators who are beginning to ask questions about the role of, for example, the child's ability to inhibit an impulsive reaction and to shift from one person to another, but that's in its infancy. You know? Yeah. Yes.
So, a lot of what we talk about when we think about cybersecurity and trustingness is teaching people to not trust bad guys, right? But there's another aspect here, which is you want to teach people to trust good guys, right? Good information. And one of your results seems a little troubling on that dimension, which has to do with the familiarity and conformity of the norms. So one of the things that your research suggests is that if I get a message, even from somebody who maybe has historically been accurate, but who is not conformed to a norm for one reason or another, I'm going to be maybe too skeptical about that information. Is there a way to so you talked about kind of the balance between reliability and reliability, familiarity and reliability, but is there a trade-off between norm conformity or social approbation and accuracy?
Excellent question. The answer is no. In other words, no. I mean,
norms trump everything.
No. The no means that we haven't done that very important experiment. So what we've been finding, in a nutshell, are that the children are sensitive to a variety of cues, separately considered. We started pitting one against the other, but that's next in line. That's a very important experiment to do, to ask about the relationship between, as it were, past history of reliability and fitting in with the norms. But I can't tell you what the answer is.
Right, especially in that context, if it's something about not necessarily what you call something, because afterward, the meaning that goes to a word is a social construct.
Right.
But if it's about something physical, you know, this
Right.
does or doesn't work, I could see trusting the norms even if somebody is inaccurate, if the piece of information that's being conveyed is in some sense a social piece of information, versus what goes on with physical reality. You could imagine a difference between how people look at social norms and those two different kinds of
Right.
information.
Yeah, we started to think about that issue a little bit. That's to say, it's true that we convey to the child the fact that this person is unreliable because, in some sense, they're violating conventions. But there are some more recent experiments where the person has given wrong physical information. For example, told the child, given the child false information about where an object is located.
Right.
And that proves also to be, to impact the child's trust. So it looks as if, I mean, it's too early to say whether the child in some sense is sensitive to those distinct kinds of unreliability and makes a distinction between them, or whether from the child's point of view, any kind of deviation from either truth or norm is an index,
Right.
and they put it all into the same pot.
Right.
But that's an important question that we need to figure out.
I'm thinking of that as an analogy to what you said, that kids will turn to other kids for how to play with things. So if I was trying to figure out, and I'm 5 years old, what's a fashionable thing to wear, I probably would be unlikely to look at somebody who violates all the norms,
Yes.
even if they have or have not been accurate in the past.
Yes.
Have you looked at differences among children who grow up in a culturally diverse group rather than a culturally homogeneous group?
We have, in some sense, begun to think about it in the sense that we so going back to the consensus studies, where we had those 4 women who were, those were done in Boston, which is fairly heterogeneous. And we wondered whether, we followed up the initial studies by looking at the extent to which, with respect to the 3 women who were in agreement, it mattered to the child whether those 3 women were from the same racial group as the child or whether they were from a different racial group. So you could imagine that the child says to itself, as long as these women are in agreement, I don't care where they come from. And the reason why this relates to your question is that we did it both in Boston, which is fairly heterogeneous, but we also did it in Taiwan. So in Taiwan, you have a more homogeneous Asian culture, so that in Boston we had 3 women who were either white European women and 3 women who were Asian women formed the consensus. And we had the same thing in Taiwan. And so we wondered whether we would get stronger effects of consensus in Taiwan, insofar as, in some sense, the deviant might be even more deviant from the child's point of view. We didn't find that difference between Taiwan and Boston. What we did find, though, in both places, was that the impact of the consensus was greater if indeed those women were from your cultural group. And that was particularly obvious when the group dispersed, so to speak, and you're left with a woman who belongs to a consensus, and the center, and the woman who belongs to the consensus is either a member of your cultural group or not. So, I mean, sorry, I'm giving you too long an answer, but very briefly, what the results are suggesting then is that both in a relatively heterogeneous or diverse culture, children are nonetheless sensitive, at least to those racial differences, and those differences impact the extent to which the child thinks of this person as a trustworthy member of the consensus. It's as if they say to themselves, oh, if there's a consensus in this group that's not mine, I needn't pay so much attention. They kind of screen that out, but they're hypersensitive when it's their own group. Yeah.
So, one more question, because our hour has now become 70 minutes. So, one question, I think.
Yeah, I was just curious about, you focus on children, but what about adults? Is there research on whether adults are more prone to trust and believe people from their own cultural group than others?
I mean, the short answer, I think, is yes, but I can't quote you chapter and verse. But I mean, social psychologists will argue that at some tacit, I mean, although adults will be more, as it were, explicitly articulate about their lack of discrimination between social groups, their openness to other groups, at more tacit levels you can still uncover sensitivities. And it looks as if those tacit sensitivities do impact the way in which they pick up on new information as well. Yeah. But the paradigms that we've been used have not been used in precisely the same way, so I'm extrapolating to some extent from the child work to the adult work. But I mean, in some ways, you know, looking at things like endorsements by well-known, famous people, the implication is that there's going to be continuities. In some sense, adults are sensitive to the Elmo effect in the same way that children are.
I have a lot of stuff now.